Our next speaker is going to be John Bellinger. He's a co-owner and chief technologist of Evolv, the largest domestic manufacturer of e-cigarette control electronics. John has personally designed or led the design team for 21 electronic cigarette product families and spoken on e-cigarette safety advances and the need for product standards to industry groups as well as the FDA and NIH.
All right. Well, with the buildup like that from Lou, I can't help but disappoint. But I really, well, the first thing to know about me, I'm not a scientist. I'm an engineer. And the difference there is the scientists go find the information. The engineers say, what can we do with it with our tinkery little fingers? So really, anytime we run into, hey, there's an e-cigarette problem, I'm like, yes, there's something else for us to fix. So, I mean, I really believe in the category as an engineered product, just because, unlike a cigarette, which is an agricultural product, the only thing you can do if you come up with a problem with it is stonewall and defend. You can say, okay, well, we found a bunch of formaldehyde. How can we not have formaldehyde? And I'll get into that. But then, I might as well at least get into it. This is Evolv. You know, we're the largest manufacturer of ENS control circuitry. If you've never heard of us, it's because, in this country, if you've never heard of us, it's because we don't make branded products. We make the controllers that essentially do all of the, you know, functionality from charging to temperature regulation to power regulation to display to user interface for other people's products. And a lot of the reason we do that is because we do manufacture domestically. That line is extraordinarily automated. Most of our customers are in China, so we manufacture electronics here. We ship them to China. The first time my partner Brandon, who does the sales side of that, actually went to China because people were basically looking to put our stuff in their products. He has a great story where, you know, he went to customs and wrote down, okay, what are you doing in China? I'm selling electronics. And they took it, scratched it out. No, 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 you don't understand. You're buying electronics. No, 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 I'm selling electronics. So the new American dream is we make electronics and sell them to China, who sells them back. We were the first to introduce direct wattage control, which solved the problem of, well, the coils are all different. How do you get consistent results out? And we also introduced direct temperature control as a result of the formaldehyde stuff, and I'll get into that. So other than the control circuitry, ends from the smallest, wimpiest cig-alike to the biggest obnoxious vape bro cloud chasing device are very, very similar. They all have a battery. They're all the same lithium-ion batteries. They have essentially two styles of heating coil, and then they have some control electronics. And the heating coils, there really are only two designs. This is a horizontal coil, so liquid flows into the wick, which is wrapped with the wire, apply power to it, and you get vapor. The other style is the vertical coil, where you have a coil, you wrap the wicking around it. And that's really the only distinction. So the major difference from an engineering standpoint with these products is scale. So if you have a little tiny device that makes a little wispy smoke, you've got a very small coil. If you've got a giant device, you've got a very big coil. But functionally, other than, you know, shout out to British American for coming up with something new, other than that, all of the devices are pretty much the same. So if we get down to the right parameters, we can analyze them, you know, device to device, even if one's a cig-alike and one's a mod and one's a pen style and blah, blah, blah. So one of the things that's really lacking in the literature is we analyzed this device. Well, for the benefit of us engineers who had to go through heat transfer and thermo and all the rest of that, could you tear the device down, measure the coil size, measure the coil wire gauge, the wicking, all the rest of that? Because if we had that information, we could really do a lot better job of, you know, taking results from one study and extending it to another study and figuring out what between them in unsteady devices we could get. But the heating coils are pretty much all the same functionally. They're just different sizes, and different metals have different resistances, but the electronics can compensate for that. It's really just a scale issue. So there are two things that we really care about when we're looking at e-cigarettes from a, you know, basically a laboratory perspective. One is vapor yield, and that's how much vapor. And it's primarily a function of power. So you're generating vapor at a certain power for a certain amount of time, and essentially the integral of, you know, power, which is energy, will give you the amount of vapor for any particular device. Now, devices have different efficiencies. Essentially, the more thermal mass they have, the slower they are to heat up and the more energy you waste in heating stuff that isn't the liquid. Bigger devices tend to be less efficient, vertical coiled devices tend to be less efficient. But if you can characterize all of those, you can actually get a pretty good idea of, for any particular device, what the yield's going to be. And if you've characterized enough of them, you can get a pretty good idea of what the yield's going to be from an unstudied device. And yield is interesting from a, from a laboratory standpoint, from a dosing standpoint. But the nice thing about yield is it does seem like users can self-titrate for nicotine, which is good because you don't want people thinking they're getting a little bit of nicotine and they're actually, somewhere up in the, addictive or dangerous range. Unfortunately, what users think they can self-titrate for and can't is what's in the vapor. So there's been a lot of work recently on, starting with the, hey, if you turn these things way up, there's formaldehyde, getting to why. This is a study that I really like because it's device independent. It doesn't actually use a e-cigarette at all. What they essentially made was a temperature-controlled fog machine and then ran that through HPLC. So they could control the coiled temperature very, very accurately and then just sort of plot for different vapor constituents and vapor humectants where the breakdowns were, because they really do go very, 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 very little formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, acrolein, the rest of that, until you get to a break point, and then it just, it skyrockets. So when people say e-cigarettes are safer than cigarettes, having the data, I'm like, well, for most of the people, yes. There's that one guy who, just cranks the thing way up, and, so there may actually be users running non-temperature controlled devices that are, at least from a formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, acrolein perspective, getting more than a cigarette. And that's not a popular revelation, but it is a reality we have to deal with. Now, the other tricky thing is coil temperature is a function of power, airflow, and time. So you can't actually simultaneously control dosing and temperature. So what we do is we power control up to a temperature limit and then cut power off, to lower and lower levels if you hit that. There are different ways you can play with that, but because you don't have control over the airflow, you can't say, hey, user, I'm just going to blow into your lungs as hard as I want because I really want you to have this specific dose and this specific temperature. They don't like that. So you really have to sort of have a trade-off one way or the other, which is, again, why it's important that vapors can self-titrate. So you really, from my perspective, it's more important to control constituents. Okay, so one of the things, because all of our devices can measure temperature, and they actually all can stream data back out to a computer for data logging purposes, one of the things that we can see that people doing many studies can't is how parameter dependent the reported data is. This is the exact same atomizer with 5 subsequent puffs. The only difference between these puffs, I turned temperature control off, is one's at 10, they're both 10 watts. One is a puff every 30 seconds, one's a puff every 5 seconds. And as you can see, the 5-second puff is hotter. So the question is, 30 seconds is great, that's an ISO standard. I'm ISO, the systems group administrator for the subchapter and blah, blah, blah. But ISO is useful for comparing devices to each other, but it's not really that useful for saying what are things doing in the real world. And a lot of the data points in the literature, in my opinion, are anecdotal. You say, well, we picked these parameters and we found these things. You say, okay, but why did you pick those parameters? And often it's convenience or arbitrary choice, or it's a standards sort of a thing. And from that, you get a lot of kind of spurious conclusions. Like one of the things that I've heard that drives me up a wall is, well, after 3 seconds, or not 3 seconds, after 3 puffs, the temperature in an e-cigarette is consistent. You say, well, yes, in the study that looked at that, that is what they found. But what happens if you build and you can even sort of see with this little coil device, after 3 puffs, it's pretty much stacking up even with the fast one. What happens if you have a high thermal mass coil? So we did that, and here's after 3 puffs, it's still climbing with a 5-second interval. because there's no thermodynamic basis for 3 seconds. 3 seconds is just what happened to work with early cig-alike devices and sort of became a rule of thumb. And you just hear bandied about like, oh, of course, which is, you know, of course you can't fly faster than the sound barrier, or of course, you know, whatever. There's no thermodynamic basis for it. Whereas if you have temperature sensing devices, you have an actual, honest to God, you know, thermodynamic parameter you can control device to device to device. So, you know, studies that report temperature are much more useful than studies that report we tried it and it did a thing. And one of the reasons this is important is because user behavior isn't that consistent. How do I know that? Because all of our devices that we've made since 2015 record data. And if users opt into that, they stream the data back to me. So for example, you know, we record a number of things, and we actually publish daily snapshots of the stuff that we record and put publicly available at e-cigs.org. So that's average puff time. And we've got 180,000 or so reporting devices out of the maybe 2.5 million we've made. So it's very easy for me to say, for our devices, what's a representative puff time? Swoop, swoop, there's the distribution. That was from a couple of days ago. I can look how they change over time, things like that. So by doing sort of big data approaches like this, we can measure, you know, from device parameters what the users are doing. So it would be really, really helpful if the studies, you know, would get to device parameters, because then we can say, here's 180,000 people what they did. When the studies say, well, here's what they did does, you know, we could sort of close the loop that way. But I encourage you guys to go to e-cigstats.org. We have a lot of, you know, statistics and data that we don't publish also for, you know, competitive reasons and because it's central to our PMTA plan. But the easiest way to know what users are doing isn't do surveys. It isn't, you know, run around finding them. It isn't even watch them in a clinical setting. The easiest way to do it is build the functionality into the device and then just measure them all. And from that we can know things like, for example, high-powered devices aren't necessarily hotter. So we took our average puff temperature for temperature recording devices, and you know, there's a histogram for 5 to 30 watt puffs. There's a histogram for 50 to 75 watt puffs. So it's not, you know, necessarily true that, okay, well, if you're cranking up power, you're cranking up temperature, because if you're cranking up power, what you're doing is building bigger and bigger and bigger coils. And this little snippet of data is off of 3 months of things that met criteria. So that's, you know, 7.5 million puffs for the low power ones and about 3 million puffs for the high power ones. This data is aggregate data, so it averages between times you plug in. So there's some uncertainty there, but you know, it's still a lot better than we watched you while you were strapped to a hospital bed, and you know, that's clearly what you're doing while you're driving down your car picking your kids up. And then really what I wanted to get into briefly is, for different device classes, what are the minimum number of things that you need to have recorded in order to be able to sort of reconstruct back to thermodynamic properties? So if you have a temperature sensing device that has reported temperatures in the literature, you need to record the puff temperature, and then unfortunately, the temperature sensing devices are more precise than accurate. They make some assumptions, so they'll repeat extraordinarily well. I mean, extraordinarily plus or minus 10 degrees. Their accuracy depends on the assumptions they're making and how well you hit that. So, you know, definitely record the puff temperature if you're looking for constituents, formaldehydes, whatever. But also have an independent verification that says, this device or this class of device is reading bang on. Is it reading 30 degrees high? Is it reading 30 degrees low? Because it will repeat. It may or may not be accurate. And then if you're looking for yield, you need the coil geometry, and then you need the puff power and the puff time, and the thermal mass. Thermal mass is something that people really don't talk about in industry because, again, I don't think most of the people who are in the biosciences had to go through thermo. But essentially, every time you heat this up, you're heating the whole system to an operating temperature. And it operates at that operating temperature until you stop vaping, and then it cools back down. So all the energy that it takes to get from cold to where you are is totally lost. And that's actually a lot of where, if you look through studies and say, well, this device seemed to have a lower device efficiency than this one, if you could back out thermal mass, a lot of that goes away. Because every time you puff, you're losing the energy to get there, and then it dissipates over the next minute or so as between puffs. But really, for temperature sensing devices, this is all you need to be able to characterize pretty well, plus a thermodynamic model. Now, if you're a power-controlled device, for yield, it's exactly the same, because yield's a function of power. For temperature, 3 minutes, okay. For temperature, you need the power and the airflow, because the faster you pull across the coil, the more cooling the coil gets, and also the more vapor it generates. You need the puff and the interpuff times to figure out how long it was heating, how long it was cooling, what the temperature of the next puff was. You really need the atomizer construction because they're all big version, small version, but if you don't know that, sort of a lot of the data for applying to different devices is lost. And then you need a way to independently measure coil temperature to build your thermodynamic model. If you have a voltage-controlled device, life's even a little bit worse because now your temperature is a function of your power is a function of your coil resistance. So on top of everything else you had to do, you have to measure the coil resistance, and it needs to be the coil resistance for each atomizer or coil you're attaching because those can vary 20 or 30%. Sometimes they can drift with time, with temperature. And then yield, again, you have to measure coil resistance. And if you have a first-generation device which is unregulated, on top of all of that, you get basically your output voltage is a function of your battery, which is a function of how discharged your battery is. So you need for each puff to measure the output voltage because these vary from 4.2 volts to 3. Power is voltage squared over resistance. So even if resistance doesn't change, full charge to empty charge, power is a function of 2, which means your temperature during the puffs is fluctuating fairly wildly as the device discharges. So for that, you're really, if you, for some reason, are forced to measure or characterize an unregulated device, you need every puff, the voltage, and the coil resistance, and the power, and the airflow, and all the rest of that. But if you have all of these recorded in your studies, then you can take it back and hand it to an engineer and say, okay, figure out the thermo, and how does this extend to other devices? How does this fit into the literature? Is this an outlier? Is this adding to the bulk of things? Without this, you're really sort of just, here's a flashlight, it's like you're playing flashlight tag. You can never see the whole picture. And really, the analogy that I want to leave you with for especially voltage-controlled devices is what we hear a lot is, oh, well, we measured it at 4 volts and we got some formaldehyde. And that's a lot like saying, well, we're looking at car crashes. So we measured the accelerator position, and 3/4 of an inch from the floor, it seems like we get a lot of car crashes. Which is, simply the same. You're not wrong, but that may not be the controlling parameter. So putting a bolt 3/4 of an inch from the floor is unlikely to save a lot of lives and crashes versus having a speedometer and a speed limit. So, really, the more studies that can get to temperature, get to power, get to yield, the better overall understanding we're going to have. And I think at that point, we'll open it up for questions. Or not. Yes.
Thank you so much. I would have one question. So, in your opinion and in your expertise, what are the critical changes in the product over the time? So, what's really may affect the performance, the safety of the product? Comparing brand new product versus product that somebody is using over 1 year, and how the product changes.
Well, the biggest change is going to be your wicking. Wicking tends to be cellulose, and it both dries out, and because they call these vapor, it's not really vapor except really in my world where right at the coil liquid airflow interface, it is vapor for about a split second before it recondenses into an aerosol. But there are things that don't vaporize, plastics from the tank, other degradants and things in the liquids. So eventually you get sort of a cruddy buildup. And you also get some caramelization, things like that, especially liquids that have sugar in them. So the wicking eventually dries up, and then it gets crunchy or it won't wick anymore. Which is why if you look at like all the tank systems have replaceable heating coils, because that's essentially, here, have some new wicking. The coils, if you're running temperature control, they don't burn out, they don't really, degrade to a meaningful extent. But no, it's buildup of non-volatile, non-aerosolized juice and dry out of the wicking. The batteries eventually go flat, like any battery will, but that's sort of a secondary issue. The electronics they work, they're not fast degrading or anything like that, but it's primarily the coil wicking material that degrades, which is why they're replaceable. And sir.
Yeah, you mentioned that yield is a function of power,
Mm-hmm.
but also you mentioned that there are differences in liquids.
Yeah.
And how doesn't that affect the yield also?
So the heat capacity, essentially what you've got, now I need a blackboard, but you've got essentially, if you have your coil here with your wicking material behind it and your air exposed on the other side, the three places your heat can go is it can go into the juice and boil it, it can go into the juice-liquid interface and conduct away, or it can go into the air. Heat capacity of propylene glycol and glycerin are actually fairly similar. So yeah, there is some contribution from what your PG-VG ratio is, but it's not as huge as, I've got a giant coil I have to heat up before it does anything versus I have a tiny one. But no, there is some contribution there, but if we could get down to the point where the only problem we have in characterizing yield is PG-VG ratio, I would be so pleased.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah.
How does temperature, do you know how temperature might affect particle size and systemic deposition of maybe the flavors or the nicotine?
So I didn't talk about this, but we were one of the groups that NIH had developing a standardized research e-cigarette. So we did actually look at particle size as a function of temperature, and it really isn't. I have some data on what particle size is a function of, which I can't share because it's part of a development project of mine. But it is. I can send you our data on particle size versus temperature. That's not what it's primarily a function of, at least in the analytical work we did.